When Russian President Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, he expected a quick and easy victory. In less than a week, Ukraine would be his, and the rest of Europe would be able to do little more than moan for a while before accepting its new reality. Only that's not what happened. Putin's 5-day invasion has now lasted for more than 3 years, and he's still nowhere near taking Ukraine. To make matters worse for Russia's leader, all he's really succeeded in doing is waking a sleeping giant. Germany now stands directly opposed to Russia as it prepares to build the strongest army that Europe has to offer. This isn't an idle claim. It came straight out of the mouth of the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. Speaking during his first address to the Bundestag on May 14, Merz outlined precisely what he wants Germany to become. Strength deters aggression, he told assembled politicians. Weakness, on the other hand, invites aggression. Merz's implication is clear. For too long, Germany has been masquerading as a strong military nation while trying to paper over the cracks of its internal weakness. That has to change, especially in the face of Putin's growing aggression. And the only way to make that change is simple. Germany has to create Europe's strongest army. That starts with a renewed focus on the Bundeswehr, which is Germany's military. The federal government will provide all of the financial resources that the Bundeswehr needs to become the strongest conventional army in Europe, Merz exclaimed. This is more than appropriate for the most populous and economically strongest country in Europe. Our friends and partners also expect this from us, and what's more, they're actually demanding it. In other words, it's time for Germany to put its money where its mouth is. Over the last few decades, Germany has shied away from rebuilding its military. The reason is part philosophical, which will be covered soon, and partly because the country has built one of Europe's strongest economies. However, while that economic strengthening was happening, military weakness persisted. Despite being one of Europe's leading power brokers, Germany didn't have the sheer might needed to present a threat to Russia, instead preferring to rely on European allies and the United States to handle all of that. Merz says it's time for a change. Our goal is a country, a Germany and a Europe that are together so strong that we never have to use our weapons. So there's a twofold message being delivered to Putin. The first is that Germany is preparing to come roaring back as the massive military power that Putin hoped it would never become again. Don't underestimate how worrying this is for Russia's leader. When he invaded Ukraine, he would have been relying on nations like Germany choosing to stay on their military course. That might have set him up for future invasions, perhaps in the Baltic states or against Poland, which could lead to the establishment of a 21st century version of the Soviet Union. That hasn't happened. Instead, Putin is still laboring in Ukraine and now has to deal with the fact that he's awoken a sleeping giant from its slumber. The second message Merz is delivering here comes from his hope that Germany will become so strong that it will never need to use its weapons. It's not enough to build an army that could defend Germany against Russia. Merz wants more, a German force that, when combined with the rest of Europe, is so terrifying that Putin won't even consider launching an attack. Perhaps Merz's new approach could be worrying, especially for Germany's allies in Ukraine. Do the Chancellor's words suggest that Germany will switch its focus from supporting Ukraine to strengthening itself? No, says Merz. The German Chancellor vowed that Germany would remain one of Ukraine's strongest financial and military backers even as it institutes its new build-up. There must be no doubt about where we stand, Merz thundered, namely unconditionally on the side of the Ukrainians. And this is an area where Germany is bound to back up its word. The nation is already the second strongest supporter of Ukraine, behind only the United States on the military aid front. It's delivered around $53.8 billion of aid to Ukraine already as of April 30. Plus, March 21 saw Germany approve a new $3.36 billion aid package to add to the $4.48 billion it already promised to Ukraine for 2025. Germany's goal of building Europe's strongest conventional army won't happen at the cost of supporting Ukraine. It'll happen alongside it. Merz realizes that Ukraine is now the frontline force in a war that threatens to engulf all of Europe. At least that seems to be the approach he's taking. Supporting Ukraine means it takes longer for Putin's expansionist ambitions to reach the rest of Europe. Ideally, that support will lead to a Ukrainian victory, meaning Germany never has to use the massive military it intends to build. If that doesn't happen, Merz is making it clear that Germany will be ready for a fight. The rest of Europe will likely think that it's about time. According to Global Firepower, or GFP, Germany currently has one of the strongest militaries in Europe, but given its economic power and size, it's further down the list than it should be. GFP ranks Germany as the fourth strongest European power, behind France and Italy in second and third respectively, and the UK in first. Germany's power has increased compared to 2024. It started that year in 6th, but has since leapfrogged both Ukraine and Spain to hit 4th. Still, that simply isn't enough. Newsweek also points out that Germany's military power within NATO isn't where it should be. Germany will never overtake the US in the collective defense organization. The US spends far more money. However, in addition to being behind the 3 European nations previously mentioned, which are also NATO members, Germany also sits behind Turkey. So Merz's comments seem to be as much about making Germany what it should have always been as they are about presenting a threat to Russia. He's saying that it's time for Germany to pull its collective weight in Europe, within the European Union and inside NATO. Here's exactly how Germany's going to do it. It all starts with something mentioned earlier in the video: Germany's changing military philosophy. For decades, Germany's approach to its defense has been somewhat contrary. It always knew it needed some semblance of a fighting force, especially as it evolved to become one of Europe's strongest countries financially. But the specters of the past weighed heavily on the country's collective soul. Germany outright rejected military might as a means to reinforce its geopolitical standing due to its history of doing so in the past. German Marshall Fund member Markus Zehner makes the reason clear to the BBC. "We started 2 world wars. Even though it's 80 years since World War II ended, the idea that Germans should stay out of conflict is still very much in many people's DNA." It's almost as though Germany still believes it has a monster inside it. Unleashed, that monster could lead to a repeat of the atrocities it committed during World War II in particular. Whether that's true or not, and it seems very unlikely given Germany's standing and long-running alliances with many of the countries against which it fought during the World Wars, the spectre of the past remained. That led to Germany always favouring more diplomatic approaches ahead of showcases of its military might. This was demonstrated in how former Chancellor Angela Merkel handled Russia in the years before Putin invaded Ukraine. As the Baltic states and Poland all warned against other European nations getting too close to Russia, Germany was all business. It worked alongside Russia, becoming a major purchaser of Russia's energy resources and trying to bring Russia into the democratic fold by revealing just how much the country stood to gain from doing so. Russia took all of the money it gained from Germany and invaded Ukraine anyway. Putin slapped Germany in the face, and that slap was enough to start waking a sleeping military giant from its slumber. Still, Germany didn't wake up immediately. It dozed for several years first. Sure, there was a former Chancellor Olaf Scholz announcement of a pivot in Germany's national priorities, dubbed a Zeitenwende, or a historical turning point, in the immediate aftermath of Putin's Ukraine invasion. Germany would commit $108 billion to boost its military, with Scholz saying he wanted to keep warmongers like Putin in check. Though a solid first step, this really amounted to the sleeping giant lifting a single eyelid. The European Council on Foreign Relations says that the announcement of the Zeitenwende led to the creation of 2 Germanys in some people's eyes. The first was the Germany that Scholz wanted to present, one that was in lockstep with Ukraine's other allies and was doing everything it needed to boost its military. In some respects, that interpretation was correct. Under Scholz, the German government met the 2% of gross domestic product or GDP spending that NATO recommends for the first time in around 30 years. And as mentioned previously, it stepped up more than any other European nation when it comes to delivering military aid to Ukraine. But there was a second interpretation, one that suggested that Scholz simply hasn't done enough following his Zeitenwende speech. He's been too hesitant with arms deliveries to Ukraine, delaying sending essential weapons that could have weakened Putin's resolve. Under this interpretation, some viewed Scholz as a man who acted when pushed into a corner, delaying his decisions until he had no other option. By that point, what Germany could deliver to Ukraine, or itself, would be a case of too little, too late. Perhaps it's this second interpretation of Germany post-Putin's invasion that led to Merz being elected as a chancellor in 2025. With Merz, Germany has a leader who's unafraid to not only label Putin as what he is, which Scholz himself did many times, but to back up that rhetoric with action that showcases that Germany is no longer going to allow the weight of its involvement in past wars to weigh it down. Therein lies the change in military philosophy. Now, with both eyes open, the German giant is leaving its history behind and seems determined to return to somewhere near its former military power levels. Only this time, it's going to defend against the expansionism that marked its past military endeavours. This view is reflected in some of the country's youth. One 18-year-old named Charlotte Kreft, who was interviewed by the BBC, sums up the changing tide of German thought. For a really long time, we thought the only way to make up for the atrocities we committed in World War II was to make sure it never happened again, and we thought we needed to demilitarize, she says. But now we are in a situation where we have to fight for our values and democracy and freedom. In other words, Germany believes it's now on the right side of history. That change in its view of itself justifies the military build-up that Merz now promises. Of course, none of this change in philosophy would mean anything without action to back it up. Scholz got the ball rolling by committing more money to Germany's military than at any point during the past 3 decades. But now that the sleeping giant is awake, it seems determined to push the pedal to the floor to accelerate its development into the military power Merz intends for it to become. That's evident from many of the actions Germany has taken in 2025. Take the country's removal of its debt brake as an example. In March, Germany announced that it would scrap this brake, which has long acted as a constraint on the country's economy designed to prevent it from getting too deep into debt with any other nation. Becoming legally binding in 2016, the brake essentially prevented either Germany's federal government or any of its 16 states from taking out extra loans. Instead, they were obliged to balance their books due to strict limits placed on any new borrowing. There were some exceptions. The federal government was permitted to engage in net borrowing up to a maximum of 0.35% of Germany's economic output. But in global economic terms, that amount was always a pittance. For instance, Germany's gross domestic product in 2022 was $4.25 trillion. The federal government was thus able to take out loans worth up to $14.56 billion. While great for Germany in an economic sense, the debt brake practically halted investment based on loans into the country's military. Now the brake is gone, and its disappearance has cleared the way for Germany to spend big on defense. Germany is committed to making the most of that new spending power, which will play a huge role in Merz's goal of transforming his country's military into Europe's strongest. The Zeitenwende announcement marked the moment Germany hit NATO's recommended spending target for the first time in decades. Under Merz, the country aims to go much further. Germany's parliament approved a new law in March, around the same time that it pulled its debt brake, that exempts all spending on defense and security from the country's remaining debt laws. The move will create a staggering $547 billion infrastructure fund intended to pay for the improvements Germany intends to make. Under Scholz, committing around $100 billion to defense was seen as an important first step. This latest move represents a giant leap. As Merz said at the time, the decision we're taking today can be nothing less than the first major step towards a new European defense community. He also spoke about how Germany had been lulled into a false sense of security in previous decades, though it was wide awake now. These are messages consistent with Merz's latest proclamations. Germany's Chancellor is making promises and taking actions to back up his rhetoric. He's talking about how Germany's spending, which will lead it to having Europe's strongest military, benefits Europe just as much as it does Germany. And the false sense of security comment tells Putin that Germany is aware of the position it placed itself into and is now wide awake to the threat Russia poses. And it gets even better on the spending front. A few months ago, US President Donald Trump insinuated that NATO members should be spending 5% of their GDP on defense rather than the recommended 2%. At the time, the comments were met with some skepticism, not least because they seemed to come on the back of many of NATO's members finally hitting the 2% target that Trump had complained about them not reaching before. It appeared that Trump was trying to move the goalposts, perhaps to justify an attempt to remove the US from NATO at some point in the future. Now, it seems that viewpoint has changed, with Germany leading the charge. On May 15, news emerged that Germany is backing Trump's call for all NATO members to hit 5% of GDP spending. The spending may not be done in the way Trump envisioned. The new idea comes from NATO chief Mark Rutte, who proposes that NATO members should now look to spend 3.5% of their GDP on defense, with a further 1.5% dedicated to other security matters. That structural change seems to have curried Germany's favour, as the country's foreign minister, Johann Wadephul, explained. But one should look at the result, he says, and the result is indeed the 5% demanded by President Trump that he believes are necessary, and we are following him in this respect. While this might seem by some as Germany pandering to US demands, especially with Wadephul suggesting that the US is very satisfied with what Germany is achieving, it also signifies that Merz is serious about making his country's army Europe's largest. You can only do something like that if you spend big. Germany is going to do just that, and it's encouraging the rest of NATO to follow in its footsteps. So Germany under Merz will splash plenty of cash on defense. It's also making active moves right now to move itself in the direction Merz wants to go, starting with finding ways to get more soldiers. Right now, Germany's standing military is solid, if a long way behind the sheer manpower offered up by Russia. Germany has 181,600 active personnel and 34,000 reserves, compared to Russia's 1.32 million active fighters and its 2 million reserves. Of course, Germany has the benefit of being part of NATO, which delivers hundreds of thousands more soldiers to the fight. Still, Germany needs more people in its army if it's going to become Europe's strongest military power. Again, it started moving towards getting those people under Scholz. In June 2024, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius unveiled plans for a new military service model that will allow Germany to recruit 5,000 new soldiers annually every year from 2025, with a view to boosting its active military to 203,000 members. A few months later, Germany also approved a new military service model that will see it send questionnaires to 18-year-olds to both assess their willingness to join the military and advertise doing so as a potential career. Pistorius is now considering going further than that. He's retained his position under Merz and said on May 14 that Germany may have to return to conscription if its efforts to encourage volunteers fail. We have agreed that we will initially rely on voluntarism, a service that is initially voluntary and intended to encourage young people to serve their country, Pistorius said in his first address to Germany's parliament since Merz became Chancellor. And I say this quite deliberately and honestly. The emphasis is also on initially, in case we cannot recruit enough volunteers. Germany used to have compulsory military service. The concept was scrapped in 2011, another in a long line of moves made under the country's past philosophy of pacifistic diplomacy ahead of military might. But as mentioned before, Germany's concept of itself as a military power has changed. Pistorius is saying that he's willing to pull out all of the stops to create Merz's most powerful army in Europe. These sort of moves, coupled with actions like sending troops onto NATO's eastern flank for the first time since World War II, as Germany did on April 1st, demonstrates that Merz is serious. Those deployed soldiers will serve in Lithuania, in a unit that becomes fully operational in 2027 as a permanent deployment. Maybe this is a hint of Germany's future plans. As it grows its army, it'll deploy more units throughout Europe to showcase its new might. Those units will stand against Russia if and when the time comes. And behind them will stand a Germany that, if Merz can achieve his goals, is a far greater threat to Putin's ambitions than Russia's leader ever imagined it could be. But what do you think about Merz's claims that he intends to turn Germany's military into Europe's strongest? Will he be able to pull it off? And if he does, what does that mean for Putin, both in Ukraine and regarding his ambitions for the rest of Europe? Share your opinions with us in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more video commentary on the latest military developments in Europe.